joining us for the latest session of Conversations on Europe. Today our focus will be on the Dutch and French elections occurring this spring, the impact of populism on those elections, and the implications for the European Union of the results, or predicted results in the case of France. Conversations on Europe is a monthly series organized by the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh as part of our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence funding through the European Union. It's also supported by a National Resource Center funding through Title VI through the U.S. Department of Education. I'm Allison Delnor. I'm the interim director of that center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all and to introduce both our partners, including Florida, who has joined us, our partners at Florida International University. And we shall be joined probably soon by partners at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and the Jean Monnet Center there. And I'd like to thank them for taking the time, including, I think I see Manuel Rodriguez there. Thank you very much for helping to organize this. I'm just going to briefly set up the subject of this particular discussion, and then I will introduce our distinguished panelists, and then we'll move on with the actual substance of the conversation. But as some of you well know, last Wednesday, voters in the Netherlands participated in a general election to determine seats in the Dutch parliament. In the wake of seismic political shifts that occurred in 2016 with the Brexit referendum in the UK in June, and the largely unpredicted election of Donald Trump in the US in November, the March 15th elections in the Netherlands were being hailed as the next test of the strength of populism in Europe, and as the next stress test for the beleaguered European Union, as prognostications of a Nexit and a Frexit were bandied about, even as the UK moves ever closer towards triggering Article 50 and beginning the long process of UK's withdrawal from the European Union. When looking at the Dutch elections, pundits and reporters focused on the uniquely coiffed, xenophobic, and nationalistic Geert Wilders. In the weeks prior to the election, the news and polls then shifted from predicting the possibility of a far-right prime minister in Western Europe to the potential losses that the major Dutch parties were facing, the increasing fragmentation of the Dutch political scene, and how that compared to the rest of Europe, especially France, which will hold its own elections in April and May in a two-round system. In France, too, the story has been about the diminution of the major parties that have dominated French politics in recent decades, and about the growing appeal of Marine Le Pen, who has been successful in creating a more mainstream legitimacy for her party, the Front National, or the National Front, than it had under the leadership of her father, Jean-Marie. Today, we've assembled a panel of experts in European politics in order to take a closer look at the results of the Dutch elections last week, and to draw comparisons with the elections as they are shaping up in France for next month. So soon. Joining us remotely, then, I'd like to introduce our panelists, who are both joining us from the UK, I believe. Catherine de Vries is a professor of political science, professor of politics in the Department of Government at the University of Essex. She's also an associate member of Nuffield College at the University of Oxford. Over the years, Dr. de Vries has published extensively on European Union politics, elections, as well as public opinion and party strategy. Her work has appeared in journals such as the Annual Review of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and the British Journal of Political Science. She is currently completing a book for Oxford University Press on Euroscepticism, which is forthcoming this year. So look for it under the title Euroscepticism and the Future of European Integration. Also joining us is Rainbow Murray, an associate professor and a reader in politics at Queen Mary University of London, and a visiting research fellow at Cevepof. I don't know if it's pronounced that way. In Sciences Po Paris. She's the author of Parties, Gender Quotas, and Candidate Selection in France, published by Palgrave in 2010, and the editor of Cracking the Highest Glass Ceiling, a global comparison of women's campaigns for executive office, also in 2010. She's also published numerous articles in journals such as Politics and Gender, American Political Science Review, Parliamentary Affairs, and French Politics, Culture, and Society. Her primary research interests are in political representation, gender and politics, political recruitment, French, British, and comparative politics, political parties, and elections. And last but not least, joining me on my left here at the university, J.J. Spoon is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Spoon's research focuses on comparative electoral behavior in Europe and how party type and size, institutions, and context influence parties' decision-making at both the domestic and the European levels. And she has a particular interest in the behavior of new and small political parties. Dr. Spoon has published widely in journals such as the British Journal of Political Science, Research and Politics, European Union Politics, and European Journal of Political Research. Her book, Political Survival of Small Parties in Europe, was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2011 and reprinted in paperback in 2015. Thank you all for joining us today and giving us your time and expertise to talk about this oft covered in the press, we're hearing about it a lot, topic. So just to get started and to provide some context for viewers and for those in the audience joining us, I want to start, and I've warned the panelists a little bit about this, but I was hoping to start with Dr. de Vries and ask if you would please just provide a kind of survey of the major parties of the Netherlands, the bigger political context and the parties that have dominated traditionally.
Sure. I think the Netherlands is a quite unique party system in that there were 28 parties that were viable on the ballot. There are many parties in parliament, and it is a system of proportional representation where the votes you get basically are represented equally by the seat share. So there's no hurdle. There's no, the kind of the probability of getting a seat in parliament is quite high. Another country like that is Israel, also signified by a lot of polarization and fragmentation and division. I think that's the context against which to look at Dutch politics. And then the major political parties, coming to your question, are the kind of traditional mainstream parties that we know. So parties like the Conservative Liberals, Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, that have dominated West European politics for a long time. But in the Netherlands, not so much since about, let's say, maybe the early 2000s. And since then, we've seen the rise of a far right, but also of far left parties. And maybe even before that, a group that actually JJ knows much more about than I do, but Green parties as well, actually a party that did particularly well in this election. So it's a very splintered party system with probably 6 very viable parties, and or maybe 6 to 8 viable parties of the kind of traditional mainstream party families like Social Democrats, Conservative Liberals, and Christian Democrats, but also increasingly now far left, far right, and Green parties.
Thanks for that. I wonder, then that prompts me to ask you, JJ, could you fill in, what are some of these smaller parties that have some significance or interest for us?
Yeah, so just sort of following with what Catherine said, because of the nature of the electoral rules in the Netherlands, it allows for a lot of smaller parties to kind of break through because the threshold is so low, and they're competing for all of the seats in the Netherlands at one time. And so that's led to the development of some very interesting smaller parties, but because of the rules, they've also been able to gain representation, which is somewhat unique to the Netherlands. So some of those, just to kind of fill that out a little bit in the current election, is, for example, the Party of the Animals, which is really sort of animal welfare party that now has 5 seats in the Dutch Parliament. And I think it's important to keep in mind that the Parliament is 150 seats, right? So 5 seats isn't nothing. We also have a party called 50 Plus in the Netherlands, which is a party for pensioners. That similarly is very focused on a very narrow sort of group of individuals, and they also won, if I'm not mistaken, 4 seats in the recent election. And perhaps most interestingly, there was a party this time around called DENK, I'm pronouncing that correctly, Catherine, which means think. And this was, founded by two Turkish Dutch members of parliament after leaving the Labour Party in the last go-around, and they now have 3 seats. And so these are just some of the examples that, because of the nature of the party system and the electoral system, that has kind of, they sort of fill out the system in a way we perhaps don't see as much elsewhere, both because of sort of historical reasons, which I'm sure we'll get to, but also just the nature of the rules as well.
So in order to put this into broad context, and we'll come back to specifically the Dutch elections and the results that went there, but while we're talking about the sort of broader political landscape, Dr. Murray, I wonder if you would then tell us, how does this compare with France? What is the broad political landscape in France? Who are the big parties there that we're keeping an eye on?
Well, like with the Netherlands, the party system in France is very much structured by the electoral system. And the electoral system is unusual because it's held over 2 rounds, and any party can compete in the first round. Normally only 2 parties qualify to the second round. So this means you've got a proliferation of small parties, but you've also got a concentration of power primarily amongst the major parties. And the small parties will sometimes form loose coalitions with the major parties. But traditionally, you've had a bloc on the left and a bloc on the right. I say traditionally because this might be the first election where that doesn't really happen. The main governing party of the left, the Socialists, have fallen apart after 5 difficult years in power. The main party of the right, the Republicans, are struggling with a difficult election candidate who might lead them to defeat. And so we're now looking at 2 possible qualifiers for the second round who don't represent either the left or the right as we've traditionally understood it. So the French party system's in a bit of flux at the moment.
All right, so much to sort of dive into. First, since it's happened, and it happened last week, let's go back to the Dutch case, and then we're going to come back to France, and then we hopefully can interweave them together and then talk about the U.S., the EU, Germany, Italy. So there's a lot that could potentially come into this, because these aren't the only elections that are happening anytime soon. So, but let's cast our minds back 1 week to the elections in the Netherlands on the 15th, and just sort of broadly, for those who may not have been paying close attention, what were the results? What were the surprise? Were there any surprises that came out of that? And I think I'll throw it to Catherine for this.
Sure. So I think for one, not that I'm such an old kind of established academic, but for me, this was the first time that actually the international press seemed to be at all interested in Dutch elections. It's a very kind of small country, 16 million people, not that much happens, usually coalition governments. So that was kind of an interesting surprise. And I think that has to be seen against kind of the backdrop of Brexit, but also especially Donald Trump's victory. I'll say about that, something about that in 1 minute. So prior to the elections, Geert Wilders, so that's the Party for Freedom, as you mentioned, which is kind of the 3rd iteration of a far-right party, that kind of a modern far-right party that has developed in Dutch politics since the early 2000s. I.e., some political entrepreneurs became successful and subsided again, and Geert Wilders, who is a defector from the Conservative Liberal Party, seems to have kind of organized the most kind of successful new party launch in Dutch politics. And his party is very starkly anti-Islam, anti-immigrants, and also anti-EU. And he, since the kind of Brexit, which he celebrated as a victory of the ordinary people over the elites in Europe, has kind of staged this assault and called for a patriotic spring together with Marine Le Pen in France about kind of taking over as a possible prime minister candidate. He was polling very high. It has to be said that he's been around in Dutch politics in 2006. He always polls quite high. Some months prior to the election, and then when people need to really make kind of decisions, he kind of loosens his lead or his lead loosens a little bit, which happened this time around. But I think in this time there's one element, and then I'll talk about the results. It's also important to see that, as we know, another big development on the European continent is the increasingly kind of authoritarian move in Turkey. And as Erdogan is staging his referendum in mid-April, there he was trying, or his ministers were trying to campaign on Dutch soil. And the Dutch prime minister, who had kind of co-opted a lot of Geert Wilders' harsh immigrant language, had basically committed himself, or had kind of locked himself into a very harsh response, which is what he did over the weekend just prior to the election. And that apparently has shifted a lot of voters back to the Prime Minister party. He was perceived as ministerial, as, I'm going to get things done. This far-right guy says a lot of things, but just screams for the sidelines. So the two major coalition parties lost, but the Prime Minister party or the party of the Prime Minister, Conservative Liberals, didn't lose as much, and then got this kind of Prime Minister bonus a little bit. And then the Labour Party was virtually wiped out. It lost 3/4 of its vote share. Interestingly, the overall left and right blocs developed in such a way that even though there were big gains by the Greens, the Party of the Animals, as JJ talked about, as well as D66, centrist, left-wing leaning party, the overall bloc of the left shrank. So we saw a slightly increase on the right. And on the right, there was of Geert Wilders, who gained 5 seats, but not as much as expected, but also the Christian Democrats, who were the traditional party, who had a similar election outcome than the Social Democrats this time, i.e. they were wiped out some elections ago, are now kind of gotten some ground again with a very fierce pro-nationalist campaign. And my colleague Cos Mudde, who's at the University of Georgia, calls it even a nativist campaign. I'm not entirely sure I buy that, but it's at least a kind of co-opting of Geert Wilders' sentiment. And in that way, I think what's important to realize that even if Geert Wilders didn't do as well, if you think about a Dutch kind of low threshold system, he was able to make coalition bargaining really difficult. His issues were talked about by all the mainstream parties, and he gained 5 seats. So if you really want to look at it, you could see he did really well for himself, even though he probably expected to do better than his kind of 20 seat share that he got this time. So I think that kind of would be my kind of take on the election outcome.
Interesting. Do you want to have anything to expand to that, or maybe even talk a little bit about sort of this history that Catherine's brought up of the far right in the Netherlands?
Sure. So I think it's, and Catherine sort of alluded to the Freedom Party of Wilders being kind of the third incarnation of these far right parties, and I think it's important to kind of put that in the context of sort of what's come before it in the last 10 or 15 years. And so, the Freedom Party really very much sort of draws its connection back to Pim Fortuyn and the list Pim Fortuyn in the early 2000s. It was another sort of slightly different in many ways, but again, sort of Eurosceptic, if not anti-EU, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant type party. Its lead, and Pim Fortuyn was murdered. But interestingly, after his murder, the subsequent election, the party still ran, and they actually won about 25% of the vote, if I'm not mistaken, and about 25 seats. And so I think it's important to keep putting into context the current Freedom Party and sort of where Wilders was with, about 20 seats, which is an increase of where they were in the last election, but still actually not as high as sort of this predecessor on the far right received in the early 2000s. Obviously, it's a different political context, a different individual. It's not exactly but the same thing, but it's important, I think, always to not just look at the results of an election in that one time period, but kind of see where it connects to other things that have happened. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in the French case as well. The other thing I wanted to bring up too was, and Catherine alluded to this a bit as well, is how well the Green Party did. This is the Dutch Green Left. Klever's party, who's often referred to as the Dutch Justin Trudeau, obviously the Prime Minister of Canada, and this party really did quite well for itself in this election, increasing its seat share from 4 seats to 14 seats. And so, the question is how did that happen? And so I think that's another interesting outcome of this election. Obviously, the voters from, some of the other left-wing parties, especially the socialists, that is one of the places that they went. And so we really are seeing, whereas the Freedom Party may not have done as well as it was hoping to do, we obviously, as we just mentioned, the Social Democrats, the Labor Party really was decimated in this election. And I think one of an important legacy of this is that the Green Party that had representation in the parliament really benefited from that. And so we are really seeing sort of these smaller parties doing quite well, perhaps not as well as they had in the past or as well as they'd hoped, but even between those two parties, right, that's 20% of parliament right there, not to mention many of these other parties. And so I think that's an important sort of outcome of this election, and not talked about nearly as much during the campaign, because the sort of the issue positions of the party obviously not nearly as extreme. There's not necessarily those connections, or not extreme at all, not necessarily those connections to things that are happening elsewhere in Europe and in the US. So it didn't receive sort of the coverage in the international press in the way that Wilders' party did. But I think that's an important outcome of this election as well.
So I guess, and all of this kind of leads me to change my questions a little, and so bear with me. I'm thinking about this kind of what we're seeing happening to the left in the Netherlands, and as Ruta's party has been sort of pulled to the right, as they've had to deal with all the issues brought up by Wilders and his popularity and putting all those things, as Catherine pointed out. So I'm kind of curious, these group of parties on the left have been critical of the Conservatives and Ruta in particular. So what role are they going to be able to play in a potential newly formed government? Because that's the next step, right? They're going to have to form the government, which I understand in the Netherlands is quite a long process. And so my question is, what role will the left be able to play in being a governing power, if at all possible? And then also, we talked a little bit about what happened with Erdogan's, attempts to get sort of Turkish issues addressed, and those being turned away by Ruta, and that contributing to his popularity. But what are some of the other forces at work that are contributing to this kind of pull to the right that we're seeing in the Netherlands? And that happened for a while. I mean, if this is the third iteration.
Catherine, you wanna?
Yeah, I can definitely. I think I'll take the last part first about kind of the pull and Erdogan. I think what JJ was saying is very important, and it's been very, very under, or has not gotten that much media attention, and that's these two previous MPs of the Dutch Labour Party that started their own party that represents basically Turkish and Moroccan immigrants in the Netherlands. And I think what we're seeing now is that this was already developing in the 2000s, as JJ outlined, is when these other parties developed, that a lot of immigrants who have dual allegiances. I'm a Dutch person in the UK. I have an allegiance to my home country. I have an allegiance to my host country. And these allegiances are increasingly getting politicized by the far right, but also by Erdogan, and also by parties who are representing immigrants primarily. So usually the link between immigrant vote share and the Social Democrat Party was very high, but that seems to be broken now as well. And I think that's a very important development that we haven't seen, or we have perhaps paid very little attention to, and actually even academic attention to try to understand how immigrants make these kind of vote choices, and if they're split like that. I think I'm saying that also living as an EU migrant in the UK, and being affected by a referendum that I couldn't vote in, right? So a lot of these kind of allegiances through immigration come about, and I think that's an important, interesting research agenda to think about. And then your specific questions. Sorry, that's just a point I wanted to make because I find it interesting. But and then the point you asked about the coalitions. So if you think about Wilders, so the question is also a little bit what kind of Wilders' endgame is. If Wilders' endgame is to make Dutch politics really complicated to govern, he's been really successful for that in years, and this time around he was really successful. Because what the problem is, it looks now, if you look at this election outcome, if the Dutch government, or if the Dutch Prime Minister party is now forming is kind of trying to form a coalition, if they want a majority coalition, and they probably want to, because last time around there was a minority coalition in 2012, it fell after 2 years. It was just not stable. they will need 4 parties at least to be members. And it will span the entire ideological spectrum in Dutch politics. So from the Greens to the VVD. And these are parties that don't have a lot in common. They are, maybe, so the VVD is increasingly also Eurosceptic. It's clearly has moved to the right on immigration. Is not necessarily, is a party of kind of market liberalization, of a lot of cutting in the social services that also partly resulted to the kind of decline, I think, of the Social Democrats, because they were seen as responsible for the cuts were put forward by Rutte and his government. And then you have on the other side the Green Left or the Liberals that they don't share any of those policy positions. So it would be really, really difficult to form a coalition. And actually, some pundits suggest that Klaver, so the Dutch Trudeau, if you will, also someone of Moroccan Dutch heritage, right? So shared heritage. So he might feel personally also very, very kind of touched by how the campaign was fought. Is in the sense that you shouldn't go into a coalition. You're just going to get hammered as a junior coalition partner in a coalition with more right-wing parties that wish to change the Netherlands in a direction that you don't want to, either on immigration or on the economy. So Dutch coalition government negotiations are not like in Britain, where it's basically you have to do it within 24 hours, otherwise you look like you're taking too much time. As the last election at least was the case, because this is a country that's where now. It's not used to coalition governments. Dutch politics is very used to coalition governments. People dislike it, but it will take probably it might even take longer. If we think back in the last kind of Belgian election, where the Flemish Interest, and later on the National Flemish Alliance, so a regional party, gained a lot of seats. There was a coalition of all parties except that party, and it took them longer than the Iraqis to form a coalition. So it will really, really take a long time. I think if they're not all bluffing by what they've said in the campaign, but if we take them seriously in terms of their policy positions, I can't see how you can get an easy, smooth coalition platform or coalition program out of this election.
And just to kind of just quickly add one thing to what Catherine said. I mean, I think this is sort of a real conundrum for small parties all the time, and the Greens especially in this time around, right, where they the VVD, this Rutte's party, has approached the Greens in terms of joining the coalition, and it's a question of, right, as Catherine said, do they join effectively a right-wing coalition with the Christian Democrats and Rutte's party and D66, right? Or do they stay on the outside and really try and affect change that way? And this is kind of the classic challenge for a small party that's in a position to, as the Brits like to say, punch above its weight, right? Join a coalition, actually be part of the the policy making of the government. But at the same time, we also know, and research has shown us, that when you have small parties, especially those that are much further away ideologically from the rest of the coalition, that tends to hurt them in future elections. So it might benefit them in the short term, but in the long term, it may not actually be the best outcome. And so this, I think, is what Klaver and the party is weighing right now is, do they take this opportunity, or is this really not going to help them down the road in terms of policy? So I think that's going to drag out this process for quite a while. Good, more things to pay attention to. Keep the Netherlands in the news.
Well, I do also want to talk, and I think we can talk about this when we sort of are blending both the French and the Dutch cases. Well, Americans do pay attention to French politics. I don't think they do at the same level that they are now. And so I do want to get back to this point of, how much in the news these things have been, and then the Netherlands, and getting a significant amount of coverage as being surprising, I think is interesting, and we should kind of come back to that. But to kind of transition over to a more comparative lens, I want to ask you, Rainbow, to think, how does this compare, and in particular, I'm thinking of the kind of long-term rise of the right and the current state of the Socialist Party in France. Are we seeing things kind of trending over time where, Labour and Socialists and Lib Dems are the fact that they're taking hits in the UK and in the Netherlands and in France, is that long-term trends that are crossing, borders, or are they specific to the certain country, the individual countries that they're in, the specific political climate? So I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit on what you've heard and how it might compare to the situation in France right now.
I think to some extent they are country specific. I think some of the problems that the Labour Party in the UK is experiencing at the moment are down to its leadership. And I think the problems for the French Socialist Party are quite historically embedded within French politics. The French Socialist Party has always been less successful at the national level than the mainstream right, despite the fact that they often do well in local elections. So François Hollande is only the second socialist president of the Fifth Republic, the first being François Mitterrand. All the other French presidents have been from the right, and the right have also held parliamentary majorities more often than the left. The collapse of the left at the moment is down to a number of factors. One is that François Hollande has been a rather uninspiring leader. Many of his policies have failed to address the deep economic crisis that has lingered since the end of the last decade. He's also been seen as rather sort of wishy-washy and ineffective. He's alienated people on the left of his party by trying to adopt a more neoliberal approach, but that hasn't won over voters on the right who haven't seen the results that they were hoping for either. He also faces the problem that the far right have quite a significant presence in France and have done for a long time. Their presence is mitigated by the electoral system, which prevents them from getting seats anywhere close to their vote share. So they're consistently scoring 20, 30% of the vote, but actually at present only have 2 seats in Parliament out of 577. And even though Marine Le Pen is looking extremely likely to qualify for the second round of the presidential election, possibly in first place, it's unlikely that she would be able to win, because whilst she is effective at mobilizing up to 40% of the population, she has never been able to command a majority of support. So the position, I know that we're talking more about the socialists than about the Front National, but it all kind of goes together. Because one problem that the socialists have had over recent years is that the working class vote has in part siphoned off to the far right. So they've lost a lot of blue-collar voters who feel that they have been victims of globalization, who feel that none of the mainstream parties has been able to address endemic poverty, social division, and so they have expressed their alienation through voting for the far right. And it would be simplistic to categorize Brexit voters in the same way, but certainly there is an element of working class voters in the UK as well who've become disillusioned with the Labour Party and have moved towards UKIP. And in both countries, there's also a sort of element of rural middle class as well who have been taken away from mainstream parties towards the far right. Again, sort of a dislike of globalization and of immigration and wanting a return to sort of nationalist traditions.
So how do these far-right parties in the Netherlands and France compare? Are there significant differences in who they're appealing to as voters?
I mean, I would say that, you know, there is sort of a commonality among all of these far-right parties in terms of who they're appealing to. Obviously, they have, you know, different histories, you know, in terms of where they came from and you know, who the legacy of those supporters. But in general, you know, there's obviously a very, you know, strong, you know, the sort of matchup between kind of the rhetoric and who's supporting them, right? So both parties obviously have a very strong, as we've mentioned before, you know, anti-immigrant, anti-EU rhetoric, very nationalistic, perhaps Marine Le Pen and the FN in France, the Front National, more so even in terms of the language of you know, of how she's talking and presenting the issues. In terms of who's voting, it's, you know, those that are very, you know, the issue voters that are very much attracted by those issue positions in terms of on Europe, on immigration, on sort of feelings of nationalism and national pride and things like that. And you know, we've sort of talked about those individuals as kind of issue voters, that they're very much voting on those issues, and they both feel very strongly about those issues. But there is also very much this sort of anti-mainstream party or anti-government piece to this. In other words, you know, individuals that are supporting these parties that aren't necessarily you know, supporting their issues, but really want to send a message to whether it's Francois Hollande, whether it's the Republicans in France, whether it's Rutte or the Labour Party, that they don't like what they've been doing. And Marine Le Pen has very much always sort of couched her message in, you know, the left and right are the same. Right? Before the Republicans were called the Republicans, their name was, the acronym was the UMP, and she often would refer to the UMPS as if they were one political party, right? And differentiating what the National Front is saying from both of what the governing parties, right, left, it's the same. So I think, you know, and so you have those voters that are very much sending kind of a signal that they just don't like the governing party. They may not necessarily, you know, believe as strongly in some of the issues. And then I suppose thirdly, and it could be, you know, and this third group kind of perhaps could fit into either one of these, and do fit into either one of the ones I just mentioned, which is, you know, the sort of left behinds. And we can, you know, obviously talk more about that. We've heard a lot about the quote unquote left behinds, the losers of globalization, whatever you want to call it, in the U.S. election as well. And those that, you know, again, just feel like they've been left behind by not only, you know, the current governing, you know, the current government, by the EU, by sort of where the world is going. And we know that, we've heard a lot about that in the US, but that these far-right parties are offering some, you know, perhaps a reason for why these individuals feel left behind, right? That it's the current government policies, it's immigrants, it's the EU, it's all of these others, and we're gonna fix that in some way by reducing the number of immigrants, by taking the country out of the EU, or at least trying, and sort of solving problems that way. So you kind of have these various groups of voters, and some of these, you know, overlap and some don't. But I think the reason why we're hearing so much about these parties now, especially in the case of France, where Marine Le Pen is likely to go to the second round, is this sort of confluence of all of these different groups that are going to be supporting, or at least say they're going to be supporting, whether they actually do on election day is a different story, but say that they're going to be supporting, and that these different constituencies have grown over time. And so I think, you know, and I think that we're seeing that as well.
So this dissatisfaction with the EU, I mean, maybe part of why we're thinking so much about fearing so much the possibility of an exit or a Frexit is these are both founding members of the EU, unlike Britain, which was always kind of reluctant, it was a late entry. So did the results last week effectively end the discussion of the possibility of an exit, however likely it was before? Or will this continue for a while?
So if I may, I think I just wanted to wrap up a couple of things that links to that. I think what was said before, and something Rainbow said, and also JJ now iterated, which I think has been interesting in the sense that we've often thought of actually of kind of people's resistance towards international politics, EU making, you know, an early manifestation of that, as something to do with winning and losing. So it has to do with skills, it has to do with human capital, it has to do with education. And what seems to be left is only education. We really find a middle class which is doing relatively well, who is actually quite Eurosceptic. In the UK kind of public debate, they're called the rich Eurosceptics. I refer to them I actually find that those most kind of dark exit type skeptics that really would like to leave and vote for hard Eurosceptic parties are relatively well off. They fear a whole lot of things, but it is not necessarily rooted so much in their actual position in the economic kind of hierarchy. And I think that's a very interesting development, because that allows for these type of parties, and also kind of Eurosceptic sentiment, to mainstream much more. And in some work that I've done with the Bertelsmann Foundation, we kind of carve out this idea that that the objective conditions don't necessarily always link up that nicely with people's perceptions of those objective conditions that might have been in the past, but it seems to be kind of very much a current day debate, that of course was also seen of just looking at kind of the average income of Trump voters, right? I mean, it was quite high. And there is some stuff about kind of the Rust Belt, but that's not the entire story. And the left behind were not those that actually, created Brexit. It was a lot of the southern, richer constituencies. And I think that's quite interesting. And then linking that back to the EU case. So, and thinking about Nexit and Frexit is what it is interesting also in this link about how we thought about Euroscepticism and how it developed, that it was usually the idea that if your country is doing relatively well, you're going to be pro-EU. So i.e. the Dutch, the Dutch on average were very pro-EU because they were small, as as Katzenstein would say, a small, open, liberal economy, dependent on trade, small states in big markets, they're going to be pro-integration. But interestingly, what we're seeing in terms of if we think that there's at least, and I agree with JJ, that there's a link between the issue positions parties take and why people vote for these parties next to kind of all other explanations, we see actually a rise in Euroscepticism in a relatively wealthy country. A party like Podemos in Spain has not been able to do that well, and a party like in the south that has done well is a five-star movement, primarily in northern Italy, which is your northern European member state in terms of GDP, right? So what is interesting is that, and that's also in the UK case, that it seems to be also a discussion about how viable your country could be outside the European Union. And that's why I think Brexit is really important, that for many Dutch people, this idea of leaving the EU, which I think is overall not a majority position, but about a third of Dutch people flirt with the idea just by seeing, well, we could perhaps do it. We could weather these kind of economic uncertainty, and therefore you need to be relatively well off in order to weather it. So, it's an interesting development that we haven't, or that's what my book argues, interesting development in how we think about public opinion towards the EU that we didn't necessarily look at in previous years. So it could be that, okay, you're gaining, but relative to an alternative, i.e. being outside, you're still losing within, right? And that, of course, with the Eurozone crisis, with ideas about having to pay up for the Greeks, even if that's actually not what happened, but doesn't matter. That's very much a perception. So these perceptions being unhinged from national conditions, people not relating their economic growth to the EU, but relating it, for example, to Theresa May negotiating well or something like that, rather than kind of to the EU, is put forward kind of interesting challenges for parties. And I think that relates also very much into how the discussions in the UK about so-called post-truth, the discussions in the US about what can you tell voters and what did they believe, if we already know that in the last couple of the last decades.
Oh dear.
People their own positions, who knows what can happen. So I think this is an interesting element in kind of three ways. It kind of makes us think differently about Euroscepticism, and it could be that Euroscepticism might become a more majority position in the future. It also allows for far-right parties to, because they're mobilizing fears, they don't even have to mobilize objective conditions. They might be much more successful than we have thought in the past, especially when there's an event like a terrorist attack or something that they can exploit. And thirdly, it provides a whole lot of challenges for mainstream political elites who try to come up with figures and numbers, and that doesn't necessarily resonate that well with parts of, not with it resonates with parts of the electorate, but not with kind of a growing part of the electorate, which seems that these fears are things that elites are just not really paying attention to and don't really understand. And I think those could be things which are much more meta, if you will, and sometimes even hard to quantify and beyond these kind of particular electoral contexts. But yeah, do make me a bit wary about, well, it makes me especially wary about the Italian election, which we're not talking about, but it could make me a bit wary about kind of predicting election outcomes and how volatile they can be. And although I totally share what Rainbow says, that it's very unlikely that Marine Le Pen wins the second round, but Marine Le Pen being in the second round, Macron having some real, damning issue coming up and a terrorist attack adding to it, all bets are off kind of thing, right? So in that way, I think that's a different thing than what I would have said about her father or what I would have said about kind of far-right parties in the past. But I do share with Rainbow. I mean, it looks like if everything goes normal, that she shouldn't be able to kind of do extremely well. But yeah, the reasons I just outlined, I'm a bit more wary about these parties than perhaps I've been in the past in terms of them doing very well electorally.
Yeah, Rainbow, please.
If I can respond to some of that, one thing that I would actually agree with Marine Le Pen on, and I don't say that very often, is that she says that we're moving away from a classic politics of left and right, and the new big cleavage is now about globalization and internationalization versus nationalism and protectionism. I think we've seen that with the election of Donald Trump. I think we've seen that with Brexit. I think we've seen an element of that in the Netherlands, and we're seeing an element of that in France. And I don't think the classic conception of left and right has just disappeared. I think it's still there. But I think the classic left-right, at least on the economic left-right spectrum, is class-based politics. And as Catherine said, it's not necessarily about social class anymore. It's not a simple case that people on low incomes will vote for parties on the left and people on high incomes will vote for parties of the right. There's a much greater role now of identity politics. And that, in some respects, is a backlash against globalization. It's a backlash against international corporations, against migration of peoples, with multiculturalism. And it's also, to some extent, a sort of urban-rural divide as well, because cities tend to be a lot more multicultural, a lot more open, a lot more positive about globalization. And people in rural areas tend to be more afraid of it, perhaps because it's a more unknown quantity that seems to be threatening their lifestyles. So I think this is a growing dimension, and identity politics incorporates globalization. It also incorporates ethnicity and to some extent gender as well. We see that the electorates of far right parties are predominantly male, they're predominantly white. And so I don't think we can simply think about it anymore in class terms. I think the way that vote structures are being shaped is different now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And I think it's going to continue to evolve.
Well, they're predominantly male, they're predominantly white. Are they older too? Is there an age generational, or does that not cut across these different?
So one thing I thought was interesting this time around, there's evidence to suggest that Geert Wilders' electorate is much younger this time around than so there's this, I would say probably my generation, not that I'm young, but like, so mid 30s, mid 40s, very unlikely to vote for Wilders, but he seems to also have some pull into quite a young segment of the population. So although I think traditionally they're older, I would like to see kind of studies coming up recent, in more of these more recent elections, people being kind of socialized quite recently, if that might be changing.
I think that's the case in France as well with the National Front, and traditionally an older, electorate, but now I think you're also seeing younger voters, college educated, that are very excited by her. Is sort of reinventing, although we can argue how much she's reinvented her father's party. And so I think again, we'll be seeing that in the vote in the next month, that we'll be seeing younger voters, more college educated voters. When we say younger voters, voters, let's say under 40, that are supporting Le Pen in ways they hadn't before. And again, as we've all been saying, it's a combination of sort of those that really support sort of her issues and her positions, and those that really just see it as a strong kick to the main parties to say, hey, this isn't working. And I think it's a combination of the two. Well.
So I guess what much of sort of the commentary post, when we look at Brexit, we recently had a speaker in a recent keynote address in a conference speaking of Brexit and what the vote looked like. And when you look at least my understanding of the vote in November in the US, Trump, turnout was definitely an issue, voter turnout. And the people who would have voted to remain did not necessarily come out in as great a numbers as the people who voted to leave. Was that an issue, a deciding factor in the Netherlands result that kind of came back as a more as a less resounding sort of win for freedom, and it's a surprisingly strong showing for Rutte, or does it have more to do with what happened with Turkey? I mean, what is the result of voter turnout, do you think, the impact of voter turnout, and what might it be in France? Is it important voter turnout or lack thereof for Marine Le Pen?
So I can jump in, Catherine, you can I mean, I think that, turnout, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it was over 80%.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that I think, that brought a lot of, we might say mainstream voters out, right? Not just those, right? We know that voters that have really, have a very strong opinion one way or the other, on whatever issue, are likely to come out. And it's those that are, sort of in the middle, however you want to think about that often it's stay away. And maybe don't have as strong of an opinion. Obviously that, salience plays a big part of this. When it's a salient issue, when there's salient, when voters really see that there's something at stake, we know turnout's going to be higher. Obviously, in the recent Dutch election, it was very clear that there was something something at stake. Whether it was actual or perceived, right? That's gonna raise turnout. And so I think the fact that turnout was considerably higher than it had been in the past was very much that you had just individuals coming out that may not have, to make sure that the outcome was not that Wilders got a plurality of the votes and of the seats. And so I think that really did, in my mind, influence what the outcome was. And similarly, in France, I mean, I think, I would expect there to be, and hear others' comments on this as well, but expect there to be a fairly high turnout as well, because as more people come out, the likelihood of sort of watering down Le Pen's vote is greater, right? And whether they're voting for Macron, whether they're voting for Fillon, any matter of the many options that they have, right? That will all take away votes from, arguably from the far right. And it's important to remember that in the French case, it's a top two runoff, and so even and so that sort of, it's important in thinking about sort of how the voting for the left, for example, influences what her votes are. You have to remember in 2002 in France, there was there's precedent for there being a runoff with the far right. So Jean-Marie Le Pen made it to the second round, not necessarily because he received a higher vote share than he had in the past, but because the left basically fractured, right? So the left in France, this having issues is not new, right? And instead of the socialists, sort of making it to the second round as they were expected to, it was Marine Le Pen, and we're talking, sort of 17% versus 18%, right, in that election. But it was because the Greens, the Communists, the Radicals, et cetera, on the left, each got 2%, 3%, 4%. Well, all of that together, not voting for the left, is going to benefit, obviously, the far right. And so all of that is to say that, one, obviously there's precedent for what we're talking about, but also that turnout sort of, can matter in many ways. And so we can imagine all sorts of scenarios with that sort of fractured vote, especially in the current landscape where you have the socialist candidate, you have sort of the rogue socialist candidate. Maybe he's not actually a socialist, but in Macron, and then obviously all these other parties as well. So I think turnout is going to play a big role in the French election.
I'm not actually sure that turnout is going to be that high this time. There's been polling data suggesting that more people are convinced of going out to vote this time than in previous elections, quite a dramatic difference. And aside the risk of lower turnout, there's also evidence to suggest that people are much less decided in their vote this time than they have been previously. And that's not the case for Le Pen's voters. A lot of Le Pen's voters are quite solid in their vote choice. So if people want to vote for Le Pen, they're going to go and do it. If they don't want to vote for Le Pen, they're a bit more torn, and that is because of the unexpected and relatively weak field of alternative candidates. People in the Socialist Party, for a large part, are disappointed with their candidate because he's located well to the left of the party, and so those in the centre-left are struggling to mobilise behind him. People on the mainstream right are likewise disappointed with Fillon. He's been embroiled in a series of scandals, and so people are less certain of wanting to go out and vote for him. Macron has filled the gap between the hard left and the hard right candidates on the ballot, but a lot of people have come to him very recently. They're not necessarily loyal in their vote to him, and they might yet be swayed to go elsewhere. If it's Francois Fillon against Marine Le Pen in the second round, a lot of people are going to struggle to motivate themselves to vote for either candidate, because Marine Le Pen is still toxic to a significant portion of the electorate, but so now is François Fillon. His policies are quite right-wing. So even before the scandal, he would have struggled to mobilise voters on the left. And now following all these scandals, even more so. I think the shock in 2002 that caused so many people to get out and vote for a candidate they didn't particularly care for in order to block the far right, I think that's gone now. It's 15 years later. I think people are less shocked by the far right, less surprised by it, and perhaps less mobilised against it than they were. If it's Macron against Le Pen in the second round, which looks like the more likely scenario, I think he probably will mobilise the socialist vote, because I think people would be keen to see Macron rather than Le Pen. But I think a significant number of people who are intending to vote for Fillon would actually switch their vote to Le Pen rather than to Macron. So and a lot more will just stay at home. So I think there's quite a lot of uncertainty, both about turnout and about the conviction of who people are going to vote for if they do vote.
Wow. That's a little bit less rosy than some of the predictions that I've been hearing. And so for those of you paying attention, the dates that you want to be watching out for are April 23rd and then May 7th when that second round happens. So seeing who the second round is going to be after April 23rd, presumably there will be a second round. It seems unlikely that there wouldn't be. There never has been a first round victory that I know of. And so, yeah, and then May 7th. I have more questions, and I'm sure you will have more things you want to bring up, but I do want to give a chance and have you think if anybody here has questions that they'd like to ask. And in Florida, if you want to wave, if you have something. Yeah, we have it, but let me do this so we can see you.
Oh,
but go ahead.
thank you. I just wanted to ask about the earlier, I think, forgive me, I think Catherine is writing a book on the future of European integration. To what extent does the future of European integration play a role in all these very complicated elections that are going on? In other words, do people view Europe, the EU, I mean, they do view the EU in many different ways, I assume. Some are focused on the euro, some are focused on regulations and so on. But does the EU itself, the commissioners and others, view the future sort of decisions they're going to make on integration as how it's going to affect these elections or the elections over the next few years? In other words, is there any sense that maybe the EU will try to slow down the pace of integration in order to avoid maybe some of the more extreme votes that we're seeing here?
Who wants to tap that one?
Yeah, I could talk an entire afternoon about that, but anyway, I'll try to make it short. So I guess there's two answers to that question. One is I just recently organized at Oxford a book workshop, and then there was a person who was quite high up in the commission. And after I had outlined a couple of things, his response was, so why do we care that there's an increase of 1/3 of people who are like exit skeptics, i.e. people who are like Brexit would want to take the risk of leaving? And then I said, we care is because those people are the most likely people that are going to make a party like Le Pen the biggest party in the French election. So if Marine Le Pen, which is very unlikely, she would become president in France, that should get all the alarm bells, set up all the alarm bells for European parliamentary elites. I think the interesting element is that there's still some European elite who feel very insulated from public opinion, from politicization, from conflicts about the. That's one. But then there's the other side, and I think that's maybe represented increasingly by Donald Tusk, and who is the council president, and Juncker, who is the head of the commission, and also increasingly Angela Merkel, but who knows if she will be the chancellor of Germany come September, is that this is the idea that Europe should respond to this kind of these signals of Euroscepticism, i.e. through, the Eurosceptic vote share was the highest in the 2014 European parliamentary election. We're seeing parties who are skeptical both on the far left and the far right, especially in Western Europe, gaining ground in national elections, and we saw Brexit. That Europe should respond in some ways by going into the realm of multi-speed Europe, variable geometry, all kinds of different ways of thinking about European integration. I have my own opinions about that. I think having an outcome where still uniform integration is the goal, which all of these models seem to suggest, I think it's just not very viable, because a solution in Greece right now is not going to be the similar solution in the Netherlands. So why are we trying to do this one-size-fit-all solution? And if we look at common law, 50% of it is differentiated, i.e. is not uniform. But the EU seems to want to still give this image that there's this uniform type of response. So I think we're seeing these two responses. We're seeing, on one hand, European elites going about their business and still feeling insulated and think, well, we can get away with this. And actually, Guy Verhofstadt, I don't know if you know him, former Prime Minister of Belgium, he wrote a book, which is basically, this is the time, post-Brexit, for a federal EU, for the United States and Europe. He was on British TV. He was just ridiculed by journalists. I would have probably agreed with them, because there's no evidence to suggest that the public would like to see any form of a United States of Europe, or elected European president, or all these kind of things he's suggesting. So that's the one side, these kind of people who one would think perhaps live too much in a Brussels bubble. On the other hand, it is trying to be realistic and deal with this Eurosceptic sentiment. But as you asked in your question, this Eurosceptic sentiment is not the same in different countries. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with kind of Italian Euroscepticism, French Euroscepticism, Dutch Euroscepticism, and even within these countries, it's looking very difficult. So it's this kaleidoscope of different opinions, reflecting people's positions within their countries, but also their national conditions and the perceptions thereof. And that's very tricky. But I do think this is woken up at least people within the council, and some people, including the head of the commission, Juncker, into thinking and voicing, some more, ways to think of, can we pause integration, or can we differentiate it, or can we do a multi-speeds Europe? And I think that's an interesting discussion for years to come, with the Italian election coming up, German election coming up, and also the 2019 European Parliament elections coming up again. So, we're not going to be over yet. The election season is not necessarily going to be over after the French election. So, yeah, I think it's a very important question.
I was actually surprised at how many Eurosceptic parties there were in France. When I was looking at some of the smaller parties, there were lots of them that were Eurosceptic.
There are.
But they have a very small vote share.
Yes, yeah, and they don't do, because of, and I think, something that we've mentioned in this discussion, but I think it is important to keep in mind, especially as often gets sort of hand waved away in the American media when we talk about elections in different countries, is that there are different electoral systems, right? And I can't tell you how many things I read that made it sound like Geert Wilders was going to become the president of the Netherlands, so understanding those differences. But it is important to remember, obviously in France we are talking about a presidential election, right? So that the potential of a far right candidate, I agree, there's a lot of things up in the air. I think the likelihood is probably pretty low, but a lot can happen in the next month, as we all know. So that's quite different. But when it comes to sort of these smaller Eurosceptic parties, I mean, France's, electoral system is like ours, right? It's a two-round system, but it's a plurality single-member district system. And so you have a lot of these, you do have smaller Eurosceptic parties in France. You have a lot of political parties in France. We don't hear about many of them because of the nature of the system, and they're not able to get elected. But there are a lot of these smaller parties, whether it's in national elections or in European elections, which is actually a proportional system. And so, the French in general, right? I mean, you have, Le Pen and really giving voice to this position, and we heard it very clear last night in the first debate, which we haven't mentioned yet, which if we think our debates in the U.S. last long, this was a marathon debate of 3 hours and 30 minutes. I wrote this down because it was went well into the night, and she never mentioned Brexit by name, but she did make a very interesting comment, which is that she was not running to become Angela Merkel's vice chancellor.
Oh,
okay.
Nice.
So that makes it, very clear, her position quite clear, and she's giving voice to this Eurosceptic, perspective. But there have been and continue to be a lot of smaller parties that, in the legislative elections that will be in June, following the presidential election, they will run, they will get votes, but they are unlikely to really even get any representation in the French Parliament. Unlike some of these other parties, these smaller parties that we mentioned in the Netherlands, because so yes, she's just the loudest of them.
We have another question. Go ahead. ahead, Randall.
Hi. This is a question for everybody. I guess I'm just interested actually in knowing about the significance at this point of the European parliamentary elections. And I ask because I noted that in 2014, Jobbik gained largely on the basis, in Hungary, gained largely on the basis of its success previously in the European Parliament. And it had previously been the case that the European Parliament was just considered a dismiss. I mean, it was basically just that's a throwaway vote to show one's discontent with various things. But that seems to suggest that there's transformation in the status of the European Parliament, and I find all of this interesting because all of these parties, as populist right, are Eurosceptic. So therefore, there is some way in which this is a sign of European, oddly, I don't want to call it success, but Euroscepticism is in effect a European phenomenon, and it means that all of these parties are debating towards Europe and about Europe, and I find that very interesting and suggestive. That, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh, many thoughts. Who wants to jump in? We probably all have thoughts.
Yes, I think two things for that. I think you really, hit the nail on the head in the sense that actually, the European Parliament the European parliamentary elections have become an arena in which we can play out and try out these kind of essentious voices. And it's been it's really been a successful strategy for Eurosceptic parties to get elected nationally, which is an irony, right? So we're using European parliamentary elections to become successful about anti-Europe sentiment, and actually, some people suggest this has sparked off, increasingly Eurosceptic positions by governments, etc., because they're reacting and all these things. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting development and an unintended consequence of these type of election, and that's usually because of the factor that JJ outlined, that they are proportional, that they vote under a proportional representation system, which makes it much easier to get elected and Raybo might want to say a bit about that, but also, UKIP has had its advantages through European parliamentary elections as well, for example.
Raybo, do you want to jump in, or?
European elections have been a good arena for the Front National to get seats. Marine Le Pen is a member of the European Parliament. She's currently in trouble with the European Parliament because she's allegedly been using her expenses to pay for people to do work for the party rather than to be the parliamentary assistant that she's paying them for. But of course, that doesn't actually bother her electorate at all, because they don't want her to be working as a member of European Parliament. They voted for her as a vote against the European Union. So if she's siphoning funds off from the EU to fund an anti-EU party, so much the better from the perspective of her voters, which I guess is why she hasn't been damaged by this financial scandal the same way that François Fillon has in his fictional jobs crisis, and with exactly the reasons that Catherine says. It's to do with the electoral system. So if the Front National can get 20 or 30% of the vote, depending on the area, then that's not going to get them seats in a majoritarian system, but in a proportional system, it allows them to send a number of MEPs to Brussels. And exactly as Catherine said, it's ironic that people are filling the European Parliament with people who want to abolish the European Parliament.
Yeah, I just to kind of pick up on that, I think your comment about sort of the irony of these Eurosceptic parties filling the very institution that they would like to either get rid of or diminish its power. But I do think, and this is a really interesting point, is that by having so many of these Eurosceptic parties gaining seats in the national parliaments, in the European parliaments, and then that translating where it can into seats in the national parliaments, it's raising the salience of Europe. And so what it's actually doing is that it's making these elections to the European Parliament, which were never about Europe, more about Europe than they've ever been. And so this is something that hasn't come up in this discussion, but in any conversation about elections to the European Parliament or to the EU more generally, we're interested in the EU more generally, we often talk about the democratic deficit. right? And, the fact that the European elections since '79 were never about Europe. They were about national elections, right? It was, it's the classic sort of second order election where voters are voting for everything but what they're actually at the poll to do. Is that we're actually seeing that still is a big part of it, but I think increasingly we're seeing voters actually thinking a bit about Europe, being cued by things that are going on in terms of the European Union, and these Eurosceptic parties are doing just that, right? They're putting Europe on the table. And so on the one hand, you have sort of the irony of these Eurosceptic parties, anti-EU parties, sort of working to dismantle the EU from within. On the other hand, it's raising the salience of this issue and putting Europe on the table for voters. And so, sort of depending on what, where we see, the problem and sort of the normatively good thing here, we might be seeing both of these things going on. And then just to sort of follow up on your, on what's been said and the sort of comment about Jobbik is, I think we're seeing this pattern quite a lot, where the European Parliament elections are giving a platform for these, parties that are on the far right or on the far left, precisely because of the rules as we've been talking about, or because they're seen as, they don't matter, even though we know, of course, they increasingly matter. And what that's doing is that's giving them a boost then when it comes to the national elections. Again, that may be then cut back because of, things that we've been talking about, but, UKIP did really well in the 2014 elections, the National Front in France, the Green Party, right? All of these smaller parties really get a boost within the EU elections, and then hope to then parlay that into the national elections. So again, we're sort of seeing Europe then mattering again at the national level where it perhaps never did before. So we're seeing lots of really interesting developments.
Yeah, so one interesting development could be, and which is a bit more positive for the EU, that it looks now that the former president of the European Parliament, so Martin Schulz, is actually rallying up a lot of support for Social Democratic Party, which used to be seen as the toxic party label, but apparently he's been able to rejuvenate that a little bit in Germany. And he actually is really running on a pro-EU platform. So this is an example of someone who made his career in the European Parliament and probably wouldn't have been able to make his career because he actually is quite an outsider in German politics, and now then, jumped ship, or had to jump ship because he lost also the presidency, because the Socialist Party was not, Social Democrats were not the largest the last time around, and now he's running for the chancellery in Germany, and he could very well, it's far off, but he has a realistic chance of winning that election, and that's at least a kind of an example of the reverse, i.e. of someone who's very pro-EU using that kind of platform perhaps to spark up something at the national level. I think he might be a first. I don't think we've seen much of that in the past.
Maybe the start of a trend. One of the sort of notable differences, I suppose, between the Netherlands and France, but that is more similar between France and Germany, is the impact of terrorist attacks on the electorate. So Netherlands has been relatively unscathed compared to France, certainly. And so I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the impact of the quite number of attacks that have happened in France in the last few years on the coming election.
I think they've had quite a big impact. They have set the national mood, they've set the policy agenda. It's helped to shift the conversation to some extent away from the economy and towards security, immigration, defense, protection. People have been afraid, they felt under attack, and there's also been the opportunity for the Front National to put policies that they were advocating before any of these terrorist attacks happened, to put them centre stage and to gain legitimacy for their positions in a way that they hadn't previously managed to do. So I think the rise of the National Front since Marine Le Pen took over from her father in 2011 is partly about her attempts to detoxify the party brand, to make it a bit more inclusive, to offer welfare chauvinism, to reach out to new groups. She's less aggressive on things like anti-Semitism, anti-abortion, anti-homosexuality. So she's trying to be more inclusive to certain groups. But as JJ hinted earlier, the actual substance of the party hasn't changed all that much. It's mostly about sort of style and presentation. So the other big thing that's changed is that it has become more legitimate now to talk about crime and punishment, to talk about banning people from entering the country, to talk about cracking down on Islamism, which has been blown up in the rhetoric of the Front National to be this sort of huge problem that it isn't actually. To say that French foreign policy has not been sufficiently focused on fighting Islamists, which led to a sort of change of direction in Syria, for example. So we've seen a lot of impact, I think, on political actors. And I think it was also, for want of a better phrase, I think it was the final nail in François Hollande's presidency. He was an unpopular president already, but I think this was one of the things that helped to sink his ship to the extent that he couldn't offer himself as a candidate for re-election, which then led to the primary, which led to a very weak socialist candidate, which has contributed to the state of the election that we're now seeing.
Yeah, I think, just to follow up on what Rainbow was saying, I mean, I think that all of the, various, especially obviously in the French case, all of these terrorist attacks have really, shaped the debate and given voice to ideas that may not have been seen as, credible or as palatable in the past. And so I think, we're seeing that as well, not just on the part of Marine Le Pen, but on the part of the Republicans, the right party, as well as others. So I think it's changed the discourse of the conversation and what's, I mean, I hate to use the word politically correct, but what's politically part of the norm. So I think we'll continue to see that, whether it's on the right or the left. In many cases.
So we're coming kind of to the end, so I want to use this to kind of move us forward, to look forward a little bit, and we've alluded to this a bit, but if we know what happened in the Netherlands, we have to see what happens with the formation of the government. We've speculated a bit on what might happen in France, and I've become less sure of that, actually, at the end of this conversation, for whether that was intended or not. What are then the potential next steps when we look at, if we want to look even further forward into the fall? Germany has its elections, as we've mentioned, next spring, I believe. Italy has its elections. We can talk about the impact of terrorism in Germany. We can talk about the impact of, the migration of Eurosceptic forces. So what should we kind of look forward to, look at as we move forward into these other elections as well?
Well, I think as we look at it now, but who knows, predictions and etc. are difficult. But in terms of polling and in terms of like how we're looking at the landscape now, the German election looked like a fairly more straightforward election than it had looked last year, i.e. the Alternative für Deutschland, so the far-right party, is not doing well at all, is embroiled in turmoil, internal turmoil, is not being able to get their message out very much. Actually, the new candidate of the Social Democratic Party seems to be mobilizing with a much more pro-EU campaign. But of course, as you said, if there will be attacks or if there are things that would happen, who knows? I think what does seem to be kind of marking German politics is just your good old cost of governing. Angela Merkel has been in power for a very long time, and people are ready for a change, as we've seen earlier in many examples in the UK, or with the kind of strong executives in the UK or in France historically, and also in Germany. So, it could be very well be that we would see a change, and that might actually not necessarily go to the far right, but even, now maybe to the Social Democrats. I'm much more wary about Italian elections. Actually, I'm most worried about the Italian election out of all elections that are coming up. But then Rainbow is also maybe a bit more skeptical about the French election. So, but nonetheless, I still think the real worry is the Italian election, and for several reasons. So we've been doing with the Batsman Foundation now for quite some years now. Our own polling, EU opinions, and what we are finding is that support for membership is the lowest in the UK. That's no surprise. Actually, also not necessarily much kind of remorse. People seem to be quite happy with the fact that the referendum looked the way it was. But then secondly, it's actually Italy, and followed by France. And in Italy, we're hovering around about 50-50 margin, or 55 people that would like to remain in the EU, and a majority of people are very wary. It doesn't mean, talk is cheap. In surveys, you can say a lot of things, versus voting out is a different element. But also the euro is deeply, deeply unpopular in Italy. It's perceived as wrong, or rightfully so, as the kind of anchor on growth in Italy. It constrains, of course, the choices for governments to craft their macroeconomic policy. And that's very unpopular. And I think there's two particular parties, and as we've now heard, if we believe that or not, but The Atlantic has reported that they have received money from Putin and other sources. That's the Five Star Movement, and that's the Lega Nord. So the regional independent party, which is fiercely nowadays anti-EU, anti-immigrant, anti a lot of things, and the Five Star Movement, which is beyond left-right, is very difficult to classify, which is a party started by a previous comedian, but it's gaining a lot of traction, and it's a fiercely anti-Europe, anti-austerity, anti-Euro party. So it's a combination of strange bedfellows, right? So parties that don't necessarily align, but what we've seen previously in Greek elections, that actually ended up being the government, right? An extreme left and extreme right party, but they agreed on this, what was both mentioned by JJ and Rainbow, on the second dimension politics, right? These kind of like international politics, EU, immigration, perhaps not necessarily immigration, but even within the left, we find some latent anti-immigrant sentiment. So it will be interesting to see what happens there. And we've seen a virtual collapse of mainstream parties in Italy. Who knows if previous, dare I say, Berlusconi-type politicians would like to enter the kind of electoral arena again. But I really worry about what would happen, and also if these parties become the majority, what they will then try to do. It looks like, if we think about an exit, that Italian scholars have told me that constitutionally it's very difficult for Italy to have a referendum on international politics. But I'm sure a clever political entrepreneur could find some way how to circumvent that, and to have an election and a referendum that is informative or something like that, which has to then later on be followed. So I'm quite worried about that election coming up next year.
Rainbow, do you want to offer your thoughts?
Yeah, I would not be entirely surprised if Angela Merkel got re-elected. Actually, she's still got a sort of lingering support amongst the electorate that would make most three-term leaders very jealous. But of course, the big issue that she's had is the million refugees from Syria and other countries who've come in, and the difficulty in integrating them, and she's faced a lot of opposition for that. So I think that is going to be probably the battle that she's most going to have to face in September. And from a humanitarian point of view, I hope she wins, because otherwise that sends a very worrying message to other world leaders about their attitude to refugees. And as regards France, the position and their future in the EU depends obviously on the outcome of the presidential election. Macron is very pro-EU, Le Pen obviously very anti, but France has a lot of interest in staying in the EU. They are key beneficiaries of the common agricultural policy. They also have a lot of influence, probably at the moment playing second fiddle to Germany, but still, second amongst equals is not bad. So I think I don't think there is an appetite at the moment for a referendum amongst political leaders other than Le Pen. But I think if there was any attempt to call a referendum, I think a case could be made to persuade the French to stay. I think the most interesting thing is going to be if we do have Macron and Le Pen in the second round, assuming that Macron wins, and I do think he would beat her, how he's going to form a parliamentary party, how he's going to have a working government bearing in mind that his movement En Marche has existed for less than a year. At present, the only members of parliament that has are people who've sort of come over to him from other parties and whose loyalties are questionable. So getting a working majority would be an immense challenge and something that's completely unprecedented in French politics. So I think normally the presidential election is where it's at, and the legislative election is really just a sort of an anticlimax that gives whoever won the presidential election a majority. That's not going to be the case this year. This year, the legislative election is going to be just as interesting.
Just to follow up on that, obviously we could continue talking for quite a while, but I'm aware of the time. Just to, I guess, maybe make a couple of points. I think, maybe the takeaway in sort of moving forward is really that, the mainstream parties, or the parties that have really been sort of, let's say, the engine of Europe since, World War II, are really changing. And if they're not changing wholeheartedly, like, they're being challenged in a way that is perhaps unprecedented. And so I think, these challenges from the far right and from the far left, or from new parties like Podemos in Spain, for example, are going to continue, right? And one could argue that that's sort of healthy for democracy, right? That we're not just sort of sitting back and letting the sort of big left-wing party, the big right-wing party just continue as they have continued, and it's really sort of challenging their positions. We know that these smaller parties are more responsive to voters. And sort of really, pushing, making the democratic system more alive, as it were. Now, we may not necessarily like where that's going, but I think that's what we're seeing. Now, from the mainstream parties' perspectives, they're not going away anytime soon, right? We're not going to wake up tomorrow morning or after the French election or the German election or the Italian election and have all of the parties that we've known in the past disappear. But they may be heavily, their vote shares and seat shares may be heavily knocked down, as you saw with the Labour Party in the Netherlands. Their positions may be pulled to the right or to the left. If they want to stay relevant, they need to be responsive to sort of these contagions on the right and on the left. So I think that's kind of where we are, and it's a bit of a wake-up call for these parties that if they want to stay, relevant, that they really need to listen to what's going on. I do think, just finally, and I know we're at the time, that I think the German election will really be something to watch, because I think what we don't have in Germany, like we've seen in the Netherlands, like we see in France, like we see in Italy, is really this strong sort of agitation from a far-right party. Obviously, we have the Alternative for Germany party that is a stronger far-right Eurosceptic party than we've ever had before, but they are polling considerably lower than the Social Democrats or the Christian Democrats of Angela Merkel, where they're polling in the 30s. The AfD is still, the last I saw, 8-9%. And so there really is, I think, as much as we kind of draw these sort of patterns across Europe, there are some very specific things that we need to keep in mind based on legacies and history and things like that also.
Well, thank you all. This has been great food for thought, and I've learned a lot. I hope you all have too. Thank you to our panelists for joining us and for sharing with us your expertise and your predictions. We will not hold you to anything that you said here, although it is recorded. But I do appreciate that, and it makes me sort of all the more eager to see what happens, but I also want to follow up on some things. Do this again around the German elections, and also potentially a follow-up on women in politics in Europe, because noticing how many women's names we're bringing up in this, and there's some interesting things that go along with that. So for now, I will just thank everybody. Our next conversation in Europe will be next month, but it will be in Portuguese, on Portuguese culture, Iberian culture. And until next time, thank you all very much. Have a good day.
Thank you for having us.